Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and it is wonderful to be with you on this Thursday. Hope your week's been going well. Hope you have some exciting weekend plans coming up. I hope that you have entered to win our giveaway from Tuesday, Call Me Phaedra by Lisa Pearlman. It's a really interesting book about a very fascinating, complicated woman involved in civil rights movement, in the women's movement, in so many interesting events of the time. So please do enter to win that. You just have to go to social media and comment on the post with episode 88 and you'll be entered to win. So please do that. If you joined me last week on Thursday, I did an episode on World War II novels. I went through a phase a little while ago where I kind of inadvertently started reading a bunch of novels set in World War II, historical fiction, which I love, and I said that this Thursday I would be talking about more of those novels, which I am and I am not. So as I was thinking about this episode, I wanted to talk about one more World War II historical fiction novel called War Brides, but I also wanted to talk about another novel by that same author, and the author is Helen Bryan. So we'll be talking about two novels today by author Helen Bryan, but stemming from last Thursday's episode where I talked about historical fiction set in World War II. So we will be starting with that tie-in, historical fiction set during World War II. That book is War Brides by Helen Bryan, as I said. And I can't remember if I read this one first. I think I actually read the second one that I'm going to talk about. I think I read that book first, The Sisterhood. And it was one of those things that it was one of those Kindle deals that came up and it looked interesting, so I checked it out. I hadn't read Helen Bryan before. Loved it so much that I looked for other things by her and then read War Brides. Also can't remember where in the whole scheme of the historical fiction set in World War II I read War Brides, but in there somewhere. Doesn't really matter for you as the listeners. So let's talk about War Brides and the description of this book by Helen Bryan. With war threatening to spread from Europe to England, the sleepy village of Crowmarsh Priors settles into a new sort of normal. Evacuees from London are billeted in local homes. Nightly air raids become grimly mundane. The tightening vice of rationing curtails every comfort. Men leave to fight and die, and 5 women forge an unlikely bond of friendship that will change their lives forever. Alice Osborne, the stolid daughter of the late vicar, is reeling from the news that Richard Fairfax broke their engagement to marry Evangeline Fontaine, an American girl from the deep south. Evangeline's arrival causes a stir in the village, but not the chaos that would ensue if they knew her motives for being there. Scrappy Elsie Pigeon is among the poor of London who see the evacuations as a chance to escape a life of destitution. Another new arrival is Tanny Zaman, a young Jewish girl who fled the horrors of Europe and now waits with her newborn son, certain that the rest of her family is safe and bound to show up any day. And then there's Frances Falconley, a madcap, fearless debutante whose father is determined to keep her in the countryside and out of the papers. As the war and its relentless hardships intensify around them, the same struggles that threaten to rip apart their lives also bring the 5 closer together. They draw strength from one another to defeat formidable enemies: hunger, falling bombs, the looming threat of a Nazi invasion, and a traitor in their midst. and find remarkable strength within themselves to help their friends. Theirs is a war-forged loyalty that will outlast the fiercest battle and endure years and distance. When 4 of the women returned to Crowmarsh Priors for a VE Day celebration 50 years later, television cameras focus on the heartwarming story of these old women as war brides of a bygone age, but miss the more newsworthy angle. The women's mission is not to commemorate or remember. They've returned to settle a score and avenge one of their own. So that is the description of War Brides. And you can probably tell that in addition to there being the theme of historical fiction set during World War II, I also am drawn to books about strong women, about women's friendships and the way those relationships are forged during times of difficulty, how those relationships grow and change and sometimes get stronger, sometimes not. Also, the theme to many of the books that I talked about the last week and this would have the added element of a more contemporary part of the story and a looking back part of the story. So they're both they're both historical fiction, and maybe this one is 50 years after, so not quite contemporary, but still that more modern look, and then looking back at the historical section. I loved this book in terms of the relationships of the women, of trying to figure out exactly what they are doing at the 50th anniversary it says they're there to settle a score and avenge one of their own. So you have to work through that mystery and figure out what happened, why they're trying to avenge, who they're trying to avenge, all of that kind of vagueness that you don't find out until later. And I'm not going to ruin it for you, but that's part of it. But also just the stories around these women's lives, because each of them comes from a very different set of circumstances, a very different area. They aren't all from this rural village. They come from, there's the Jewish woman who has fled and escaped. She's now waiting for the rest of her family, which, that's a really heartbreaking story in so many ways, on so many levels, as you can imagine. There's a woman from the deep south who is she's got secrets of her own, but you can imagine being not only from a different continent, but then coming into being the outsider, and then being the outsider during this time of rationing and hardship and all of that, and trying to forge relationships, especially with someone that broke their engagement to marry you, and how do you deal with that in a small community? So there's these wonderful friendships that they're, not always easy. They're not always pretty. The times weren't always easy and weren't always pretty, but we see them growing and changing throughout the war as they struggle to figure out what they are doing, how they are going to, just how they're going to make it through these circumstances. And then you get, of course, the added element of the 50 years later and the perspectives of the women now that it has been 50 years. They've lived so much more of their lives, and now they're trying to figure out, from 50 years on, how to settle a score, how to avenge one of their own, what exactly happened, etc., etc. So there's a lot of layers to this book. There's a lot of things going on here besides just the historical fiction. You'll again notice that I tend to lean towards books with strong female protagonists, with strong female friendships. Pretty much all of the books that I've talked about in terms of the World War II historical fiction have had strong female protagonists. Most of them have had strong female relationships and friendships as well. So yeah, I think we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about another book by Helen Bryan, very different, set in a completely different time frame and period. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am talking today about two novels by author Helen Bryan. The first one was War Brides, which is continuing from last week's episode of our World War II historical fiction series. And then the second one is The Sisterhood. So as I said, I can't remember. I'd have to look at my book list to see which one I read first, and I didn't look that up before the podcast. But in terms of publication dates, The Sisterhood comes second. It was published in 2013. War Brides was published in 2012. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. So this one is called The Sisterhood. It is not World War II historical fiction. Still has, as you can tell from the name, strong female protagonists, female relationships. But let's go ahead and read the description about The Sisterhood by Helen Bryan. Menina Walker was a child of fortune. Rescued after a hurricane in South America, doomed to a life of poverty with a swallow medal as her only legacy, the orphan toddler was adopted by an American family and taken to a new life. As a beautiful, intelligent woman of 19, she is in love, engaged, and excited about the future, until another traumatic event shatters her dreams. Menina flees to Spain to bury her misery in research for her college thesis about a 16th century artist who signed his works with the image of a swallow, the same image as in the one on Menina's medal. But a mugging strands Menina in a musty, isolated Spanish convent. Exploring her surroundings, she discovers the epic sagas of 5 orphan girls who were hidden from the Spanish Inquisition and received help escaping to the New World. Is Menina's medal a link to them or to her own past? Did coincidence lead her to the convent or fate? Both love story and historical thriller, The Sisterhood is an emotionally charged ride across continents and centuries. So again, you will notice some themes. Strong female protagonists, both a more contemporary storyline and a historical storyline, this time in terms of Menina, who is kind of stumbles into doing to searching for the lives of these 5 orphans. It's not what she was meaning to research, because, you know, she had gone to work on her college thesis about this 16th century artist, but she ends up instead trying to find out the stories of these 5 orphan girls, and do they have some connection with her, with the fact that she is an orphan, that she has nothing from her life before the hurricane except for this medal. Lots of intrigue and mysteries going on in this story. So again, lots of different layers. Now, it's been several years since I read this book initially, but I remember being sucked in to the story, not only Menina's story, but the story that she ends up researching, and all of the tie-ins, the different periods. I mean, it's kind of epic in scale in terms of 2 different centuries, 2 different timelines. You know, there's South America, there's Spain, there's Georgia, where she's adopted. Her family is in Georgia, so you've got 3 different continents, 2 different timelines. And so while I don't remember every tiny detail of the book, I remember it sucking me in and really enjoying the pace and the storytelling. Helen Bryan is a great storyteller. I would say that for War Brides as well. That one sucked me right in as well. I love the fact that she writes historical fiction, but very different historical fiction. She's not writing, she could have stuck with the World War II era for her historical fiction. She'd already obviously done a lot of research. There are numerous stories that could still be told about that time period. She could have stuck with historical fiction even if it wasn't during World War II, at least historical fiction in Britain. And she didn't. She went in a completely different direction. So I'm impressed by that. I am not an author, so I don't know how difficult that is for authors in general to kind of veer in that complete different direction. She's also written at the time that she'd written these two, she'd also written a biography, so she clearly likes research. She now has 2 books that I haven't read, but she's got a trilogy. The 2 of the first books of that trilogy, one is out. The second one comes out September of this year. It's called the Valley Trilogy. The first book in that is called The Valley, and the second one is called The Mountain. So I'm intrigued. The first one, The Valley, came out in 2016. The second one comes out September 4th of 2018. So I do actually want to find out where she's going next. This is an epic historical trilogy, according to Amazon. It is the sweeping, unforgettable tale of hardship, tenacity, love, and heartache. Okay, so left suddenly penniless, the Honorable Sylvia Grafton, a Viscount's orphan daughter, sails to the New World to claim the only property left to her name, a tobacco plantation in the remote wilds of colonial Virginia. So that's pretty much what I wanted to find out, was the time period and where this is. So remote wilds of colonial Virginia. What I don't know is, from this description, is if there is a more modern element. It doesn't look like it from what I'm reading, but that doesn't mean there isn't. So I am intrigued. Now the only question is, do I wait until the third one comes out so I can read all 3 of them at once? Or do I start now and then have to wait for the third one to come out? I've asked this question before, but I'm going to ask it again. What would you do? What do you do when there's a series of books and you want to read them, but you don't know when the last one is coming out? Or, this is a trilogy, so at least you have an end point. There's the one coming out in September and then maybe another 2 years, because it was 2 years between the first and the second. Maybe not. What do you do in this case? Do you wait? Do you put it on a list that reminds you, oh, hey, yeah, I wanted to read this? Do you have a to-be-read list? Or do you put it into a mental list that you may or may not remember? Or do you just go ahead and read them and then that's a follow-up question. Do you reread, if it's been a couple of years or a year, do you reread the previous ones before you read the one that just came out so you can refresh your memory? Or do you just jump in and start to read? I have done it both ways. Both ways have their pros and cons. At any rate, the Sisterhood. I was talking about the Sisterhood and then I got sidetracked, but books do that to me. They send me off into rabbit holes all the time, which I love. And you could kind of say that this book, The Sisterhood, sends you off into rabbit holes. I mean, Menina's life certainly doesn't go in the direction that she's expecting. Obviously, first in terms of her engagement, and then in terms of going to Spain and expecting to be researching one thing, getting getting stuck somewhere she's not expecting to be stuck, taking refuge, and then discovering this story that she's not expecting to research and getting sucked in, finding things out about herself, her personality, her, the way she looks at the world, because that is one thing that books like this tend to do. They take the protagonist in unexpected directions, and as part of that journey, the protagonist then finds out things about herself that she might not have realized before. Or maybe she realized but didn't know what to do with the realizations or the skills that she has or those types of things. So always a journey of discovery, but a multi-layered journey of discovery. And Helen Bryan is really good at that, those multi-layers of stories and time frames and female relationships, etc., etc. So I am looking forward to reading more by Helen Bryan. And if you're intrigued, you should definitely check her out. Of course, her books are on Amazon. I'm sure you can find them Kindle, hard copy, etc. So how many times have I said etc. in the last couple of minutes? I feel like Yul Brynner from The King and I, etc., etc., etc. Rabbit hole. Sorry. Distracto girl tonight. Don't know what is going on with me. Anyway, Helen Bryan. Love her. Looking forward to reading more. Intrigued as to where her next book might take her, because she definitely doesn't stay in one place in terms of her writing. We're going to take a break. I'm going to see if I can get my brain to focus. And when we come back, we'll be wrapping up this episode. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. The first two segments I spoke of books, historical fiction books by author Helen Bryan, one set in World War II, one set in, a couple of different timelines and 3 different continents, the Sisterhood. And I have not yet read a third book by Helen Bryan, so this third section is not on a book specifically, but I thought since I was talking about World War II historical fiction that I would kind of wrap up a few things. So last Thursday, when I said what got me thinking about this was my interview with author Jeannie Dixon about her historical fiction set in World War II, Grounded Hearts. That's kind of where I started, and I didn't mention what episode that was last time. So that is episode 33 if you want to check that out, interview with Jeannie M. Dixon. Her book is Grounded Hearts. That one is set in Ireland in World War II and involves a downed American pilot and the policy that Ireland had at the time of turning in those pilots. So the protagonist has to figure out when she finds him. She's a nurse. She wants to help him, heal him with his injuries, but then she has to figure out, is she going to hide him? Is she going to turn him in, send him to a prisoner of war camp, etc. So that's what sent me off on this tangent. And then last Thursday, I spoke of 3 books. The Book Thief, that is set in Germany during World War II, The Nightingale, which is in France, and then Sarah's Key, which is also in France. So we've had France, Germany, England, and Ireland. I have also talked in one of the earliest episodes, episode 4, I talked about yet another historical fiction set during World War II. Can you imagine? It's as though there's a theme going on here. And that was At the Water's Edge, by the same author as Water for Elephants, Sarah Gruen. That one is set in Scotland, but also America. Starts out in America. I can't remember what state, unfortunately, but then the characters go to Scotland. It's World War II, also a quest for the Loch Ness Monster, and a lot of figuring out of relationships and what's important. And there's some very complex relationships going on in that as well. Some characters that you really want to root for, and some characters that are just not likable, but that's the point. Sometimes you need some of those characters that you don't want to root for to help you root for the other characters even more. So it's a bit of a mystery. It's a bit of a romance. There's, again, different layers. So I think that's maybe all I have talked about in terms of historical fiction set during World War II, but I don't know. I'd have to look back at the episodes. I'd have to look back at my book list and see what else I've read. I know I've read more throughout my life than I have talked about here. So that leads me to kind of wrap up this historical fiction set in World War II themed portion of our podcast episodes. Makes me want to know, though, what era in historical fiction do you have an affinity for? Are you a fan of Regency romances, maybe? Are you a fan of books set in Victorian times? Do you have a certain location? Maybe you love historical fiction set in France. Maybe you love historical fiction set in England. Maybe, somewhere South America. There's 7 continents. Historical fiction set in Antarctica. Now I'm curious. I know there is some. There's got to be some, right? What time period do you like for your historical fiction? What area of the world do you like for your historical fiction? Hit me up on social media and let me know. I would love to hear from you. Also, social media, just a reminder, we do have the one giveaway going on for Call Me Phaedra. Not historical fiction, but actual history, biography of movement lawyer Faye Stender. And so if you go to Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram and comment on the post with episode 88, you can enter to win that. That giveaway goes through next Saturday, which is the 16th. And then winners will be announced on the following Monday, June 18th. So please enter that giveaway. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, I love spending time with you, talking about books. It's awesome. I'd love to hear what you think. So either comment on this episode or hit me up on social media, whatever is easiest for you. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining me. Join me again on Tuesday for another episode. In the meantime, though, get out there and get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.